Samantha Johnson lived what seemed like a perfect life: a loving husband, a comfortable home, and a respectable place in her community. But beneath that polished exterior, she was hiding a dangerous secret. She had been having an affair with a man named Greg Thompson, a relationship that, if exposed, could ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. Samantha thought she could keep her affair hidden, but her stepson, James Carter, had discovered the truth. At 21, James wasn't interested in protecting his stepmother's reputation. Instead, he saw an opportunity to gain something for himself. He began to blackmail Samantha, threatening to tell his father, Michael, unless she met his demands. What started as a simple extortion scheme quickly escalated, with James asking for more and more money, more favors, and ultimately more control over Samantha's life. Samantha, terrified of the fallout, complied, hoping to keep the affair a secret for good. But the situation spiraled out of control. The tension between Samantha and James grew, and the stakes became higher with each passing day. What began as a quiet threat behind closed doors turned into a dangerous power struggle. The once calm household would soon become the scene of a violent confrontation, where betrayal and desperation would lead to deadly consequences. A secret affair, a manipulative stepson, and a web of lies all collide, setting the stage for a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Samantha Johnson had always been the picture of a perfect wife. At 38, she was married to Michael Carter, a successful businessman, and they lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. From the outside, their lives seemed ideal: dinners at fancy restaurants, vacations, and the appearance of happiness. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Samantha had grown distant from Michael over the years. He was often busy with work, leaving her feeling lonely and disconnected. It wasn't long before that loneliness led her to make a decision that would change everything. It started innocently enough. Samantha met Greg Thompson, a charming man in his early 40s, at a local coffee shop. He was rugged, confident, and paid attention to her in a way Michael hadn't in years. Their conversations became more frequent, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. What began as casual conversations soon developed into something more. Samantha found herself drawn to Greg, excited by the attention he gave her. It wasn't long before they were meeting in secret, hiding their affair from everyone, especially Michael. Greg made Samantha feel alive again, and she convinced herself that what they had was special. She didn't think about the consequences or what would happen if anyone found out. For months, they continued their affair in secret, but nothing stays hidden forever, and Samantha's world would soon start to unravel. James Carter, Michael's 21-year-old son from a previous marriage, had been living with them while attending college. He and Samantha had never been close, and their relationship was strained at best. James had always been suspicious of Samantha, sensing that there was more to her than the polished image she presented. He often kept to himself, but one night he stumbled upon something that would give him all the leverage he needed. It was a late evening and Samantha had gone out, claiming she was meeting friends. James, curious about her behavior, decided to check her computer. There he found emails and messages between Samantha and Greg detailing their affair. He quickly realized that his stepmother had been lying to his father for months. But instead of going to Michael right away, James saw an opportunity. James had never liked Samantha, and this was his chance to take control. He began blackmailing her, demanding money and favors in exchange for his silence. At first, Samantha panicked. She couldn't afford to let Michael find out about her affair. She feared losing everything: her marriage, her comfortable life, and her reputation. She agreed to James's demands, hoping to keep him quiet and avoid any more complications. But James wasn't satisfied with small favors. He began asking for more money, more control over Samantha's life. He would show up unannounced, demanding whatever he wanted, knowing that she had no choice but to comply. Samantha was trapped, caught in a web of lies and manipulation. The once strong and confident woman now lived in constant fear of what James might do. As the weeks went by, the tension between them grew. Samantha became increasingly paranoid, constantly worried that James would expose her secret. She tried to keep her affair with Greg going, but the pressure was too much. She could barely sleep, always thinking about how her life could fall apart at any moment. Meanwhile, Greg remained unaware of the storm that was brewing behind the scenes. He had no idea that Samantha was being blackmailed or that James was watching her every move. Samantha's attempts to cover her tracks became sloppy. She started making mistakes, leaving clues that anyone could find. Her phone would light up with messages from Greg and she'd become jumpy whenever Michael was around. Michael, who had always trusted his wife, started noticing the changes in her behavior. She was more distant, distracted, and anxious, but whenever he asked, she'd brush off his concerns, saying it was just stress. Samantha's world was crumbling, and she knew it. She was desperate to keep James from telling Michael, but no matter what she did, she couldn't stop him from escalating his demands. What had started as a simple affair had spiraled into a nightmare. Samantha was now living in fear, trapped between her desire to keep her life intact and the threat of being exposed. James, on the other hand, felt powerful. He enjoyed the control he had over his stepmother, watching her squirm under his demands. He had always resented her for marrying his father, and now he was getting his revenge. But as his blackmail continued, James began to realize that he could push her even further. He wasn't content with money or favors anymore. He wanted total control over her, and he would stop at nothing to get it. Samantha was reaching her breaking point. The constant pressure was too much, and she was beginning to unravel. She tried to distance herself from Greg, hoping that cutting off the affair would ease some of the tension, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. As the situation escalated, Samantha found herself on the edge, trapped in a dangerous game with no way out. Little did she know that this game was about to turn deadly. With her life in freefall, Samantha was about to face a confrontation that would change everything. Samantha Johnson thought she had some control over the situation after agreeing to James's initial demands. But it didn't take long for things to spiral even further out of control. What started as simple blackmail quickly turned into something much darker. James became emboldened by his ability to manipulate his stepmother. With every demand Samantha met, he pushed for more. At first, James had only asked for money, which Samantha begrudgingly provided. She hoped it would keep him quiet, at least long enough for her to figure out what to do next. But the money wasn't enough for James. He began to see just how much power he had over Samantha, and he wanted to see how far he could push her. He started making her do things that humiliated and frightened her small tasks at first, but they quickly grew into more extreme demands. The sense of control thrilled him. Samantha's fear grew with each passing day. She became anxious and paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder, worried that James might expose her secret at any moment. She had tried to end her affair with Greg Thompson, thinking that cutting ties with him might calm the situation, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Now, even if the affair stopped, James still held all the cards. Michael Carter, Samantha's husband, was growing increasingly suspicious. He noticed the tension between his wife and stepson, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was happening. Samantha tried to act normal, but her nervous behavior became more and more noticeable. She couldn't focus during conversations, she seemed constantly distracted, and Michael began to sense that something was deeply wrong. Samantha's attempts to reassure him only made things worse, as her lies became less convincing. James, on the other hand, seemed to be thriving. He enjoyed the power he had over Samantha, watching her squirm every time he made a new demand. He had always resented her for marrying his father, believing that she didn't truly care about Michael and was only interested in his money. The affair had confirmed his suspicions, and now he was determined to make her pay for betraying his father. As James's demands grew more outrageous, Samantha's mental state began to deteriorate. She couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of her secret being exposed and her life falling apart. She stopped meeting Greg, hoping that would ease her guilt, but the constant pressure from James was too much to bear. She knew she had to get out of this mess, but she had no idea how. Every time she thought about confessing to Michael, she was consumed by fear of losing her marriage, her home, and everything she had built. One evening, things took a darker turn. James confronted Samantha in the kitchen while Michael was out of town on business. He had grown tired of playing games and wanted to up the stakes. This time he demanded something much more personal and humiliating, something that shook Samantha to her core. She refused, finally standing up to him after weeks of submission. But James wasn't having it. He threatened her again, making it clear that he was ready to go to Michael and destroy everything she cared about. The confrontation left Samantha shaken. She realized that James had no intention of ever stopping. As long as he had control over her, he would continue to escalate his demands, pushing her further and further until she broke. Desperate, Samantha began to consider options she had never thought possible. The fear of losing her marriage and the shame of her affair being exposed made her feel cornered. In her mind, there were only two ways out. Either she could confess everything to Michael and face the consequences, or she could find a way to silence James for good. The next day, Samantha reached out to Greg for help. She had kept him in the dark about James's blackmail, but now she felt she had no choice but to involve him. Greg was shocked by what Samantha told him. He had always known their affair was risky, but he never imagined it would lead to such a dangerous situation. He offered to help her, though he wasn't sure how. The two discussed possible ways to deal with James, but none of the options seemed viable. Greg suggested they go to the police, but Samantha refused. She couldn't bear the thought of everything being made public, of her affair being exposed and her life being ruined. As the pressure mounted, Samantha's desperation grew. She felt trapped between the two men who controlled her life: James, who held her darkest secret over her, and Greg, who was now involved in her tangled web of lies. The situation was becoming unbearable, and Samantha was reaching her breaking point. She began to think of ways to make the blackmail stop, even if it meant doing something drastic. Meanwhile, James continued to revel in his newfound power. He had never felt so in control, and he wasn't about to give it up. He started becoming more reckless, even taunting Samantha in front of Michael, making subtle comments that only she understood. The tension in the house was unbearable, with Samantha constantly on edge, waiting for the moment when James would finally reveal everything. The atmosphere was suffocating, and it became clear that something had to give. Samantha was no longer the woman she had been before the affair. She was living in constant fear, and the weight of her guilt and the relentless blackmail had pushed her to a place where she could no longer think clearly. The situation was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before something or someone exploded. As Samantha's options ran out, the lines between right and wrong began to blur. She was no longer thinking about saving her marriage or her reputation. Now, all she wanted was to stop James, no matter the cost. The question was, how far was she willing to go to protect herself from the monster she had created? Samantha had never imagined her life would spiral this far out of control. Each day felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, where one wrong move would send everything crashing down. The constant blackmail from James had turned her into a prisoner in her own home. Every time she looked at her stepson, the resentment and fear in her heart grew. She couldn't take it much longer, but she was trapped. James, on the other hand, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. His blackmail was no longer about money, it had become a game of power and control. Samantha was no longer just trying to hide her affair, she was now trying to survive the psychological torment that James was putting her through. He thrived on watching her panic, knowing that she had no way out. What had started as a quiet form of manipulation had turned into full-blown cruelty. One evening, when Michael was out of town again, James decided to push Samantha even further. He cornered her in the living room, making new demands that went far beyond anything she had expected. It was at this point that Samantha realized James wasn't going to stop until he had destroyed her completely. She felt helpless, and for the first time, thoughts of ending this once and for all began creeping into her mind. In her desperation, Samantha reached out to Greg once more, telling him everything. She needed someone to understand what she was going through, but Greg was no longer willing to be involved. He knew things had gone too far and feared that getting deeper into the mess would only make things worse for both of them. Greg urged Samantha to go to the police, but she refused. She was too ashamed, too afraid that the truth would destroy her life. In Samantha's mind, the only way out was to get rid of James. Samantha's fear and paranoia began consuming her. She could hardly sleep at night, her mind constantly racing with thoughts of what James might do next. She began to think of ways to stop him, anything to end the nightmare she was living. The idea of confronting James and trying to reason with him had already failed. Now Samantha was running out of options, and she was becoming desperate. As the tension in the house grew, Michael remained oblivious. He noticed the strange atmosphere between his wife and son, but attributed it to their already strained relationship. Michael had always been busy with work, and as a result, he never paid much attention to the dynamics at home. This allowed James to continue his blackmail without interference, and Samantha was left alone to deal with the escalating situation. One afternoon, Samantha found herself standing in the kitchen, holding a knife. Her mind was racing, her thoughts jumbled and dark. The pressure had built to the point where she couldn't think straight. She had considered running away, leaving everything behind, but she knew that wasn't a real option. If she left, James would still have power over her, and he would expose her to Michael. She couldn't let that happen. The house had grown eerily quiet, but Samantha's mind was loud. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her own decisions. She wasn't the same woman she had been before the affair. The lies, the secrets, and the constant fear had changed her. Samantha was no longer thinking logically, she was only thinking of survival. And in her mind, there was only one way to ensure that James would never blackmail her again. That night, Samantha waited for Michael to leave on another business trip. She had already made up her mind. She was done being controlled by James, and she had to stop him before he destroyed everything. James, confident that he still had control over Samantha, didn't see what was coming. He had underestimated just how far Samantha would go to protect herself. Later that evening, Samantha approached James in his room. He greeted her with his usual smug attitude, assuming she had come to comply with another one of his demands. But this time, Samantha wasn't afraid. She had reached her breaking point, and the fear that had once held her captive had transformed into cold determination. Without saying a word, she confronted James, her hand clutching the same kitchen knife she had been holding earlier. What happened next was swift and violent. The rage, the fear, and the desperation that had been building inside Samantha finally exploded. The struggle was brief, but the outcome was deadly. James was no longer the manipulator and control, he was now the victim. In the heat of the moment, Samantha had done what she believed was necessary to stop him once and for all. The blackmail, the control, the torment, it was all over. But as the dust settled, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. Samantha stood over James's lifeless body, her heart pounding in her chest. The house, once filled with tension, was now filled with an eerie silence. The weapon still in her hand felt heavier than ever, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the act began to fade, replaced by the cold realization of what had just happened. Samantha had committed the ultimate crime. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and there was no going back. In a moment of panic, she tried to think of what to do next. Her thoughts were chaotic. Should she hide the body? Should she run? Call Greg? She couldn't think clearly, but no matter what, she knew she had to cover her tracks. Samantha spent the next few hours cleaning the scene, trying to erase any evidence of what had happened. She wiped down surfaces, got rid of the knife, and attempted to make it look like nothing had ever occurred. Her hands were shaking as she moved through the house, her mind racing. But despite her best efforts, the guilt was overwhelming. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. She couldn't escape the horror of what she had done. Morning came, and with it, the return of Michael. Samantha tried to act normal, but the tension in her body was impossible to hide. She avoided eye contact, barely speaking as Michael went about his day. But deep down, she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. She had killed James, and now there was no way to undo it. As the days passed, the weight of her actions bore down on her. Samantha was trapped once again, but this time it was by her own guilt. The blackmail had ended, but the consequences of her desperate act were only just beginning. Samantha had thought killing James would solve everything, but instead, it had created an even bigger problem, one she couldn't escape. Samantha had tried to convince herself that killing James was the only way out. For days she had been in survival mode, driven by fear and desperation. Now, standing in the wake of his death, she was consumed by a different kind of fear, the fear of being caught. Her hands shook as she scrubbed away any evidence of the struggle. She had gotten rid of the knife, but the blood on her hands, both literal and figurative, wasn't so easy to erase. Every creak of the house felt like it might expose her, every noise outside like the arrival of the police. The morning after the murder, Samantha struggled to hold herself together. She had barely slept and her nerves were shot. Michael had returned from his trip, and she tried her best to act normal, to hide the growing storm inside her. But every time Michael asked about James's whereabouts, her heart raced. She had told him that James had left early that morning, saying he needed space. Michael believed her, at least for the moment. Days went by without any word from James, and Michael started to get worried. His son had never gone this long without checking in. He began calling James's phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. Eventually, the silence became too much, and Michael decided to file a missing persons report with the police. Samantha could feel her world beginning to close in. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the authorities would be involved. Detective Lisa Hernandez was assigned to the case. With years of experience handling missing person cases, she approached James's disappearance with a calm, methodical mindset. She interviewed Michael and Samantha separately, asking the usual questions when they had last seen James, if he had been acting strangely, if there was any tension in the house. Michael seemed genuinely concerned, but Samantha's behavior caught the detective's attention. Though she tried to remain composed, her nervousness was clear. Her answers were too rehearsed, her hands trembled when she spoke. Detective Hernandez made a mental note of Samantha's odd behavior, but didn't press her too hard during the initial interview. Instead, she focused on gathering more information about James's recent activities. She spoke to some of his friends and found out that James had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Friends mentioned that he had been distant and secretive, and some even hinted that there had been tension between him and his stepmother. This revelation piqued Hernandez's curiosity. The more she looked into it, the more she suspected that Samantha knew more than she was letting on. As the investigation deepened, the police conducted a thorough search of the house. Samantha's anxiety skyrocketed. She had tried to clean up after the murder, but she knew that she hadn't been able to remove all traces of what had happened. Forensic investigators combed through James's room and the rest of the house, searching for any clues that might explain his sudden disappearance. It wasn't long before they found bloodstains in his room, small, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but enough to raise serious concerns. The blood evidence confirmed to Detective Hernandez that something violent had occurred in the house. Samantha's alibi began to fall apart. She could feel the walls closing in on her as the police started asking more pointed questions. They asked about her relationship with James, about the tension that others had mentioned. Samantha deflected as best as she could, but it was clear that the investigation was focusing on her. Greg, the man Samantha had been having an affair with, was also questioned. He had distanced himself from Samantha after learning about the blackmail, but now he found himself dragged into the investigation. Greg denied knowing anything about James's disappearance, but the police were suspicious. They had uncovered text messages between Greg and Samantha, suggesting that Greg had been aware of the tension between Samantha and James. Although Greg wasn't directly implicated in the murder, the discovery of these messages further strained Samantha's fragile cover story. As the days went by, Samantha's guilt began to weigh more heavily on her. She had thought that getting rid of James would solve her problems, but it had only made things worse. Michael was growing increasingly suspicious. He knew something was wrong with his wife, but he couldn't figure out what. The pressure of keeping her secret was driving Samantha to the brink of collapse. Every interaction with Michael felt like a test. Every conversation with the police felt like an interrogation. She was unraveling. The forensic evidence continued to mount. The police found more traces of blood in the house, and the inconsistencies in Samantha's story became impossible to ignore. Eventually, Detective Hernandez decided it was time to confront Samantha directly. She was brought in for further questioning, this time under much more intense scrutiny. Hernandez laid out the evidence, piece by piece, in front of her. The blood, the text messages, the witness accounts of the tension in the house, it was all there, staring Samantha in the face. Samantha tried to maintain her innocence, but under the weight of the evidence, she began to crack. She was tired, scared, and overwhelmed by guilt. Her once calm demeanor crumbled, and she began to stammer through her responses. Detective Hernandez watched closely, waiting for the moment when Samantha would break. And break she did. In a quiet, trembling voice, Samantha finally confessed to what had happened. She explained the months of blackmail, the fear she had felt, and the unbearable pressure that had pushed her to murder James in a moment of desperation. She broke down, admitting that she had tried to cover up the crime but knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Samantha's confession was recorded, and the police wasted no time in securing the scene and retrieving any further evidence. The case that had started as a missing person investigation had now turned into a murder inquiry. Samantha was arrested and taken into custody, her once perfect life completely shattered. For Michael, the news of his wife's confession was devastating. He had never imagined that the woman he loved was capable of such violence. As the truth about the affair, the blackmail, and the murder came to light, Michael was left reeling. His son was dead, his wife was going to prison, and his entire world had been torn apart. Samantha's confession marked the beginning of a long legal process that would bring to light all the hidden secrets she had worked so hard to keep. The news of James's death and the subsequent arrest of his stepmother sent shockwaves through the community. What had once seemed like a perfect family life was now laid bare as a story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder. As Samantha sat in jail awaiting trial, the full weight of her actions began to sink in. She had believed that killing James would solve her problems, but instead it had only brought more chaos into her life. She was now facing a murder charge, and there was no way out of it. The media quickly picked up on the story, and soon Samantha's face was plastered across every news outlet. The public was captivated by the sordid details of the case: a stepmother involved in an affair, a stepson blackmailing her, and a deadly confrontation that had ended in murder. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to cover every twist and turn of the case. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented Samantha as a woman who had committed premeditated murder to cover up her affair with Greg Thompson. The forensic evidence, combined with her confession, left little room for doubt about her guilt. Prosecutors emphasized the cold, calculated nature of the crime, highlighting how Samantha had cleaned up the scene and attempted to hide what she had done. Michael Carter, devastated by the loss of his son, sat quietly in the courtroom, barely able to comprehend how his life had unraveled so quickly. He had once trusted Samantha with everything, and now she had not only destroyed their family but had also taken away the person he loved most in the world. The betrayal was almost too much for him to bear. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Samantha had been pushed to the edge by James's relentless blackmail and emotional abuse. They claimed that she had acted out of desperation, not out of malice. The defense attorney emphasized that Samantha had not planned to kill James, but had done so in a moment of panic after months of manipulation. While the confession was damning, the defense hoped to convince the jury that Samantha deserved leniency given the circumstances. As the trial progressed, the prosecution called Greg to the stand. He reluctantly testified about his relationship with Samantha, admitting that he had known about the tension between her and James, but had no idea how bad things had gotten. his testimony didn't help Samantha's case. It only served to remind the jury of the affair that had set everything in motion. The jury listened carefully to both sides, but the facts were clear. Samantha had committed murder, and no amount of explanation could change that. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Samantha was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentence. Samantha, who had once been so confident in her ability to control her life, was now facing the harsh reality of spending the rest of her days behind bars. For Michael, the verdict brought little comfort. His son was gone, and his wife had turned out to be someone he didn't recognize. The trial had answered some questions, but it had left him with many more. How had things gone so wrong? How had he missed all the signs? And could he ever forgive Samantha for what she had done? In the weeks following the trial, Michael sold the house where everything had happened. He couldn't bear to live there anymore, surrounded by the memories of what his family used to be. He moved to a new town, hoping to start fresh, but the grief of losing James stayed with him. He tried to rebuild his life, but the wounds left by the tragedy were deep. As for Samantha, prison life was a harsh adjustment. The reality of her situation settled in quickly, and she spent her days replaying the events that had led her here. The blackmail, the lies, the murder, everything weighed heavily on her. She had lost everything in the end: her freedom, her family, and the life she once knew. The affair that had once seemed like an escape had instead become a trap, one that had destroyed her completely. The story of Samantha Johnson and James Carter became a cautionary tale in their town, a reminder of how easily things can spiral out of control when secrets and lies take over. It was a tragedy that had left no winners, only broken lives in its wake. The community, once shocked by the crime, slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the murder lingered for those who had been close to the family. Detective Lisa Hernandez, who had worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light, reflected on the case in the months that followed. She had seen many cases of family turmoil, but this one stood out for its complexity. The layers of deceit and manipulation had been so carefully hidden, yet in the end, they had all come undone. Hernandez knew that there was no satisfaction in solving a case like this, only the grim knowledge that justice had been served, but at a great cost. Samantha's story was one of desperation and regret, but it was also a reminder of the consequences of unchecked actions. The decisions she had made, the lies she had told, and the crime she had committed had all led to this moment. Now there was no turning back. The town eventually moved on, but the story of Samantha, James, and Michael would be remembered for years. It was a story of how quickly life could unravel, how one bad decision could lead to another, until there was no way out. Samantha's life was over, and the consequences of her actions would haunt her forever. The case had been closed, the justice system had done its part, but for those involved, the emotional aftermath would last a lifetime.